Hello and welcome to the Overland Journal podcast. I am your host, Scott Brady, and my co-host, Matt Scott, is not with us today because he's bouncing around somewhere in Africa. I think Namibia right now in Land Rovers. Good for him, which means that it is just me and a very good friend of mine, Bryon Bass. Thanks for being on the show, Bryon.
Glad to be here.
And Bryon is, in my mind, the true Indiana Jones. He is an archaeologist, Dr. Bryon Bass, PhD from Edinburgh University, and a storied past and a lot of interesting experiences in his life that I think directly translate to our passions for travel and our passions for overlanding. So I think we'll learn a lot from Bryon. There'll be a lot of fun topics to discuss, everything from knives to sportsmobile vans to watches. But he learned a lot in his life from the people that he's been around, including his father, who was Army Special Forces. And tell me a little bit about your dad.
Yeah, well, he actually, even before that, he was a wrestler, and then he joined the 82nd Airborne and then re-upped. And back then it was called the 77th Special Forces Group. Later on, it became the 7th Special Forces Group. So he was in the military at that capacity. He got out and actually went to the 12th Special Forces Reserves, which was down in San Pedro area in California. And shortly after that, transitioned to the movie business and became a professional stuntman.
Yeah, which is such a cool story. And Bryon was able to experience a lot of that and experience that early Hollywood stuntman scene. And what came from that is that a funny little fact, but Bo Derek is actually Bryon's stepsister. So
yeah, that's correct. My father's second wife is Bo's mother.
Yeah, it's amazing. So there's these little anecdotes that you're all going to pick up during the podcast that I think make it really fun. It's made it such a joy to have Bryon as a friend because we never run out of stuff to talk about. We spent weeks driving around Uganda and Kenya, and we never once had a quiet moment in the car because there was always so much to chat about, other than if we were just taking in a beautiful view. But tell us a little bit about your early education. What made you choose to go to Edinburgh for your PhD?
Well, before that, I was at San Diego State University, and I did my undergraduate there in anthropology, got a BA in anthropology there. And I started graduate school at San Diego State University. And there were a series of events that occurred where it was announced by the head of the department that if we were not finishing our master's degree in a certain amount of time, semesters really, that we should think about moving on or transferring to some other location. And at the time, I was focused almost exclusively on coastal marine prehistory. And I was doing some archaeology just off the coast in La Jolla, the reserve that's off La Jolla shores. And my supervisor suggested that it would be good for me to possibly explore different avenues around the Mediterranean in something similar, insular and coastal prehistory. And this was when Yugoslavia was still together. And so he had worked in ex-Yugoslavia. It wasn't ex at the time. And he basically hooked me up with a professor that he had worked with over there. And through a series of just kind of happenstance, really, I was over visiting my brother, who at the time was at the London School of Econ, and went to visit some friends that I had met working in Jordan. The stories it's starting to go down the rabbit hole already.
I love it.
So they were up at the University of Edinburgh and jumped on the train, went up there, and I was explaining to them my woes of what am I going to do? I'm not really through grad school yet, but I've been told I got to move on. And then one of them suggested that I could possibly transfer over and just go right into a PhD program. They have different parameters in the UK than we do in the US as far as teaching requirements and things along the way. So I borrowed a coat from somebody and interviewed with the head of the department at the University of Edinburgh. That individual turned out to be my supervisor when I did finally come on there. But I also interviewed at Reading and in Glasgow. And so in the end, it was just a choice of, it'll sound odd, but I kind of went with the city that I liked the best. They all have just great departments of archaeology. So that really wasn't, and nobody was working in ex-Yugoslavia because by that time Yugoslavia had started to come apart. And so I, along the way, did choose to pursue some field work on an island off the coast of Croatia in the Adriatic. And that ended up being the focal point of my PhD.
And what were some of the highlights that you experienced, not only as an archaeologist, but as a traveler? I think I remember some of your stories of riding an early BMW back and forth between school and the field locations.
Yeah, it took on epic proportions for sure. I had it was a Dell 386 laptop that was just the coolest thing ever. I mean, now it's just primitive by our standards as far as capacity and capability. But at the starting of every summer, I'd load up the R100 GS with all of my field research equipment, the laptop, clothes, pretty much everything for the next 3 months. And would ride from Edinburgh down to Newcastle, jump on a ferry, go over to Hamburg. And then from Hamburg, well, usually I'd spend some time with some friends who live in Hamburg. And then from there, right on down through Switzerland, stop and visit some friends at the university in Zurich. And then go from there down to Rijeka and get an overnight ferry. Sure. From there down to the island. Once or twice I rode all the way down the coast. There was a little bit of a time thing,
Sure.
Especially starting the summer research. I always wanted to get down there as soon as possible and get my feet on the ground and start the work. At the end of the summers, then I started to take my time. I think one summer it took like 2.5 weeks to get back up to Edinburgh. And of course, my supervisor, asked me about that.
What's going on? And is that when you first started to pick up the German language? Was that time?
No, that was before that. Maybe I could say now in hindsight, it's fortunate. I can't say that I really liked it at the time, but my mother sent me to a private school for 12 years down in the LA area. And so back then, there were foreign language requirements. So we had Spanish. I had Spanish for 6 years and then had German for 3 years. And just so happened that when I took German, that was from 10th to 12th grade, we only had about 5 people in the class. And they were all boys. And it was 1 hour a day, 5 days a week. Okay. And the teacher was a 20-something woman who was quite strict with us. And by the end of the second week, she didn't allow any English in the class anymore.
Okay. Total immersion.
100%. And a lot of play acting. And then by the end of the first year, we were conversationally fluent. And then by the end of the third year, we had exams where we would read a murder mystery story. And then we had to answer 30 questions. What was the color of the hat on the guy by the window in the train? And so you had to have not just an ability to read it, but to retain the
vocabulary too.
Yeah. And so, and if you looked at my German grades back then, you'd see a C+. Sure. I mean, very middle of the road. It was hard.
Yeah,
without a doubt.
And it is a difficult language to learn, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. There are some cases that English doesn't really have anymore. Like, for example, genitive. I mean, we really don't use it that much. And just the vocabulary and reflection of plural, singular, and feminine, masculine, things like that English, that's why I think English is at a basic level is so easy to learn.
And that turned out to be fortuitous because your partner, she speaks German as well.
Yeah, she's from the Black Forest. And
that's amazing.
We actually met in the German language at a supermarket.
Oh, that's so great.
Yeah.
That is so great. So then you started spending time in ex-Yugoslavia, which I would suspect was ripe for discovery as an archaeologist.
Yeah. The situation there before Yugoslavia broke up, there were definitely people working from the outside. A lot of British teams working, or I should say a few British teams working on some of the islands and immediately adjacent coast. And then also, of course, Yugoslav archaeologists. But at that time, unlike places, let's say like Greece or Turkey, I hate to use the term, but it just wasn't picked over.
Sure.
So on any given day, if you, for example, on the island where I did my PhD, I don't know how many sites we ended up recording, but it was well into the hundreds. And that's just on this one island. And these were unrecorded sites.
And how big is this island? How long is it? Wide is it?
It's about tip to tail. It's about 50 kilometers long, including some little islets. So it's long enough.
Is that Korčula?
Korčula is the name of that island. Yeah.
And at the time, I think that some properties started to become available. So you made a very early hedge. And
very bizarre.
Didn't you pick up some houses there?
It was a little bit later on, but I put out the word, if anyone knows anything. And I just kind of discovered that location.
Looks beautiful.
It is. It's a beautiful part of the world. It was a Riviera long ago. Man, it's a crossroads. It was a crossroads in antiquity. It was a crossroads between Venice and the Ottoman Empire. I mean, it's just the food, the culture, and I'm specifically referring to the islands. It's just great.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating.
Things are familiar, but not exactly like it is back home. And I don't mean just back home, California, but even Northern Europeans come there and it's familiar. But at the same time, within 2 minutes, you can be in some village where other than the paved road, time is still standing still, or it's maybe 300 years ago.
Oh, that's amazing. And then did you find that the archaeology is what inspired you to travel, or was it your love for travel that then dovetailed in the archaeological work?
That's an interesting question. I'd have to backtrack on my answer and give some background.
Sure.
I hadn't really traveled that much. Now I'm excluding, like, when I was, I think, about 2, my parents worked on a project. My dad worked on a project in London, but I don't really remember anything back that far. And when I was still at San Diego State University, they had a semester in London that you could sign up for.
Nice.
And I just assumed that I got a flyer for it and I threw it in the trash. And at the time, I still had my grades and other mail sent to my mom's house up in LA, mainly because I had moved a bunch of apartments and it just seemed easier to just have it all funnel into one location. And so she called me on the phone. This is all pre-mobile phones, of course. Called me on the landline and said, "Hey, did you see this thing about the semester in London?" And I said, "Well, I mean, we don't have that kind of money, for me to go do something like that." And she said, "Did you see the part about sort of a scholarship and money that the Cal State system will provide every month or week?" I can't remember. I think it was weekly. We got 40 British pounds a week as a stipend. Back then, a pint of beer was 90 pence.
Yeah, sure.
And I wasn't 21 yet. So I said, "Well, I don't know, Mom. I mean, it's the flight and everything." She said, "Oh, I'll pay for that. And then maybe when you're done, I can even get you like a Eurail pass." And I hadn't even pondered any of this.
Right.
Ever.
But she encouraged you to do it.
100%. And then that was it. After that semester in London, she picked up for me a 2-month Eurail pass. And then I had a backpack, early low pack.
Sure.
That I had packed to the gills with stuff, because I started in before April traveling, or around April, I guess. And so it was cold still up in Northern Europe, and I wanted to get down to the southern climes. And so after that 2 months of just traveling with this Eurail pass and sleeping rough and having like a very fixed budget.
Sure.
I mean, I got an American Express card at the San Diego State University. It was a student bookstore at a $500 limit. And I had maybe bought a pair of shoes or something back home and then paid it off.
Right.
And I was really stoked. It was like a pair of Chuck Taylors or something.
Sure.
For $38. And that was the only time I'd ever used it. And back then, I know people, and myself included, traveled with traveler's checks and combination of cash. But this was, pre-European Union, borders were still up. And
that would have been such an amazing time to see Europe. And I was traveling there about the same time. In fact, my early travel inspiration is a similar story. I was in the military, though, and I got assigned to southern Italy. And this was you still got the lira. This was still very much closed borders. But once you start to experience a place like Italy, which you've experienced a lot in your life, it completely opens your eyes, because in the United States, we have a lot of prehistory. There's a lot of history in the United States, but there isn't a lot of the history that we find directly familiar, like the Roman history and the things that we learn in school. We don't learn a lot about the history of the North American continent. And I remember being there and walking the streets of Rome or seeing the Colosseum and being wide-eyed, absolutely amazed, shocked at how cool the world was. And I remember when I left Italy, the only thing I could think of is, how do I make this a part of my life?
100%. And that's what happened to me. As a matter of fact, before I even did the 2 months Eurail, when I was still at school in London, one of the professors, he was actually a professor from San Diego State. And at that point, I had been studying political science. I was international relations.
Sure.
I wasn't studying archaeology completely yet. But the courses that transferred back to San Diego State were mostly anthropology and archaeology classes that one of the professors from San Diego State was teaching there. And at the end of the semester, he said, "Bass, you're a good kid. You seem to get really good grades in my class. Why don't you come and work with me in Jordan next summer?" And I probably said, sure, okay, but I hadn't traveled around Europe yet. That was, just like 3 days before I jumped on the hovercraft and went across to the continent. And then after the 2 months of backpacking around Europe, all I could think about was what's going to happen next summer going to Jordan. And that was it. I had brain juice coming out of my ear canal. It just was blown away by traveling, and that was it. Hook was in.
And you and I, we both grew up in Southern California, which is relatively multicultural for the United States. And there's a lot of crossroads of language and cultures that you experience in Southern California. But I remember being completely shocked by how different it was and how much I loved the fact that it was different.
Oh, without a doubt. Without a doubt.
Now, I would think with your specialty being prehistory and being coastal, the sea levels have changed significantly throughout human existence. So did you have to do diving to explore sites, or was that not part of it?
Of course, I made it part as often as I could. At that time, when Croatia became independent, there weren't dive shops around the island. People had compressors, people had scuba gear. But oddly enough, the few times that I did dive during my PhD research, it was old school twin steel tanks, single tank, no buoyancy equipment at all, just weight belt, jet fins, and you just had to be a good swimmer. I mean, looking back on it, it surely violates most of what you learn as far as safety as a basic sport diver. But I had also become a scuba diving instructor back at San Diego State University.
So you felt comfortable pushing those limits a little bit?
Yeah. There was obviously certain things that I needed to make sure, like, okay, does this tank have air? And is it actually compressed air and not part of the exhaust?
Or whatever. Yeah, sure.
So I did some marine archaeology. Most of it was actually with just mask, snorkel, and fins.
Oh, interesting.
Because anytime that you would find on land, say like a Roman villa or the remains of a Roman villa or some Greco-Roman artifacts, guaranteed if you went offshore,
you'd find more.
You'd find more.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and because sport diving hadn't really taken off at that time, this is in the mid 90s, didn't have tour operators or anything going out. So it was definitely possible to identify, for example, amphora fragments on the seafloor. And obviously it just goes in conjunction with what you find on the land. But I tried to do it as often as possible. Back then, though, there wasn't the active marine archaeology that's occurring now.
That sounds fascinating with how much that would correlate to what your specialty was. Yeah. And it makes me think too, when you and I were traveling through Uganda and Kenya, we had plenty of adventure on that trip. And those that are listening, you can find the story in Overland Journal, or you can find it on Expedition Portal, and we'll put a link in the show notes. But we ended up doing essentially an illegal border crossing into Kenya, because what it showed that it was a border crossing on the map, but by the time we got there, it was very clear that it wasn't. So then the local militia found us and sent us off to the police station. There's a lot more to that story, but we ended up going down to Lake Turkana, which is this very ancient place in Kenya. And it's a natural occurring lake. There is some water management now, but there would have been a lot of early human that were traveling in that area or living in that area. And we pull off down this dirt road and we find this little spot to camp, and we start setting up camp. I'm putting up the roof tent, and Bryon's walking around and tell me what you found just walking around where we were camped.
Yeah, that's probably, I couldn't say the highlight of my career, because I wasn't physically doing archaeology there in a professional capacity, but as a prehistorian, finding an Acheulean hand axe in the actual setting is that's beyond the Holy Grail.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, I guess my specialty is early Neolithic, so at the onset of humans domesticating animals and crops. And this is way before that. This is probably Homo habilis left it. So it's not even the same species of Homo.
Yeah, sure.
And just finding it there, it was just like I had studied about Louis Leakey and Richard Leakey and everyone else working in Olduvai and in the greater Lake Turkana area, where that's the cradle of civilization. That's where where humans learned and developed and first became aware of their environment, and specifically that hand axe. It's not just that there's a continuity of sorts from then until now, as far as an edged tool or a chopping tool. But it's very clear that unlike, let's say, something like a higher primate, where they'll use an expedient tool, a stick or something to get some termites, humans not only would prepare the tool ahead of time, then use it, then keep it or curate it, and then use it later on. But they also had an awareness of the materials that were better.
That would last longer.
That would last longer, the more optimal materials. And this was back then too. Now, the unfortunate part is that we don't have from that period, surviving things that are artifacts that are made out of wood or bone. They tend not to survive the archaeological record. So I'm assuming that we're skipping out, we're missing out on another part of the toolkit from back then. But nevertheless, finding that hand axe and you guys were cracking beers, I think, and they were working. Stanley they were wrenching on one of the G-Wagons.
They were,
which to me was also, I was still blown away. You probably didn't hear too many words from me at that moment, because I saw Stanley and Franz open up the toolbox, and there are these spanners and screwdrivers. And then I'm looking at this tool. This is what started it all.
It did.
And then here we are with these guys wrenching on a motor.
Yeah.
And there's the procession right there of humans and ingenuity and materials and tools and usage of tools.
And I remember because once you started to describe to me, because you didn't just find the axe, you found maybe a scraper as well.
Yeah. There
and some small
tools.
flint pieces that may have been used for spears or something like that. And it was all around the area. And I look at you and I say, Bryon, how in the world is all of this here? And I remember what you told me is, Scott, the same reason why you picked this campsite is the same reason they would have picked the campsite. It was protected from the wind, and it had these stone wall, kind of these natural stone barriers on each side. You could see that there would have been water flowing in this one area right next to where we were camped. And you said the same reason that I picked it and we picked it is the same reason however many years ago.
Yeah, exactly. And
millennia ago, they would have picked it.
You have obviously time is moving in one direction. You have geomorphology and you have vegetation changing and climate changing. And I don't mean from the recent type of climate change, but I mean just over time.
Right.
But at the same time, when you look at that landscape where we were, you can see that there was kind of an up gradient area that was kind of out of the low setting. And guarantee that was why various people probably found that little encampment, including us.
And about how long ago do you think they would have been there?
It's hard to say, because that was even totally out of context. But let's say 1.7, 1.5 million years. I mean, this is going way back.
Way back.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
I mean, that tool did, it was used.
Sure.
Up and closer to modern times. Now, I don't mean modern times. I mean, let's say like going to 100,000 years ago plus something similar, but was used. But it was very clear, obviously, to a student of archaeology and somebody who studied it and had it hammered in my head and had courses on it, that and you're at ground zero for finding that.
Right.
That's where the material is supposed to be from.
Which obviously leads to an important thing for us to talk about in this podcast, is that as travelers, we do interact with ancient cultures, and we interact with these archaeological finds in our own mind. And I think about the many, many times in my travels that I've come across something ancient. Just give the listener some good pointers on making sure that we aren't doing any damage, that we're leaving it. Obviously, there's something as simple as take only photographs or memories and leave only footprints. But what are some things that we can do to make sure that we're not damaging these sites, that we're not creating an impact that will affect future digs or future assessments of an area?
That's definitely a good question. And it's something that I get asked frequently. And if I had to qualify it before any kind of explanation, I would say that people need to be aware that there are international, national, and local level laws, ordinances, regulations that protect those resources. And there's a reason for it. It's not to stop future Indiana Jones adventurists from going out, that they are finite resources.
Right.
So once they are removed or gone or destroyed or taken out of their context before they've been studied, well, that's it. It's over.
Yeah.
And there aren't that many resources that we come across on a regular basis that are similar. I mean, obviously you can say mining ore or something like that it's at least on our planet. Those are also finite too, but you can also recycle things, but you can't recycle or make an artifact once it's been removed from its setting. And so people need to bear that in mind right off the bat. So if you think that stone tool that you found is going to be, it's so small, I can fit it in my bag, I'm going to take it back home, just remember that for right off the bat, transporting some antiquities across country borders, you're in trouble.
Yeah, big trouble.
Getting caught with that in country, you're in trouble. You don't have a permit to be there, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
I mean, the list goes on and on.
Ethically too, once we disturb something like that, you've stolen that in a way from the locals that would like to know the history of their people and maybe a local tribe, for example, or the archaeologists that work in that area, that could have been a key piece of information that would have helped them tell a larger story. So for those listening, we do interact with antiquity in our travels. Let's make sure that we respect it in the utmost and leave things where we find it. Even avoid picking things up unless you're trained in how to do that. I just leave things exactly as I find them. There are some good resources and guides around this subject, which we can link in the show notes. But let's just remember that it is such a gift for us to experience those places. Think about the next traveler that's going to come along. You want them to be able to experience it in the same way that you did. I remember just going into Anasazi ruins and the mats are still on the ground. The corn cobs are in the corner and the pots are still in one piece. And I remember my breath being taken away to see that. It looked like they had left 10 minutes before. And I took it in and I didn't even go inside because I didn't want to disturb it. And it was purely by happen chance that I was hiking down that canyon. And we just have to remember to leave things as good or better than we find them.
Yeah, definitely. And the other thing to keep in mind, I think, is that it's easy to have the view that, well, I'm just going to take this one piece of pottery. It's really small and it's going to be like my memento of visiting this archaeological site. And when you put it in a greater context, when you take a satellite view of that, let's say 1,000 people did the same thing.
Sure.
Then there's no pottery there anymore. So now you've removed, not just out of context, but it's not like you took 1,000 pieces of pottery and put them all together and removed them. They've all gone to somebody's mantelpiece, falling on the floor, the dog eating it.
Right.
It's not just out of context. It doesn't mean anything to the greater humankind. And I think that's also important to bear in mind, which is our common history. And so it's not just that the locals might want to know more about their past or where they've come from and helping them out to understand, where they're going, but it's collective past.
All of us.
Yeah. I mean, that's why, for example, that hand axe,
right,
that we found in Kenya. I mean, it's so poignant because that is
the beginning of all of it.
Yeah. For everybody, for a pocket knife, I have in my trousers right now, to a pocket knife that somebody has who's in Kenya now,
right,
or somebody in Russia, somebody in Asia. The knife that they have in their pocket that's the heritage.
Right.
It's collective, and there's no other way to put it. At some point, you need to do the right thing, and a lot of times doing the right thing, especially when nobody's looking, and that does happen a lot when you find, especially when you're remote.
Yep.
And you find things. There's nothing wrong with photographing it, checking it out. These days with the internet, let's say we found something remote. I can get on the internet and type in Anasazi specialist,
sure,
or Southwest prehistorian, and come up with probably more than a dozen professors and grad students that specialize at and say, hey, look, we found this site. It's a mile from the known one, but it was just kind of,
here's the coordinates.
Yep. Yeah. And, go check it out. And
which leads me to a little bit more of an overland topic, which is you call your sportsmobile like the archaeologist's backpack. And I think that would be fun to talk a little bit about. You have a sportsmobile and you have a Tacoma that you had a long time. And then you just recently acquired a Land Rover LR4. But tell us about your Sportsmobile. It is definitely one of the more unique van builds I've ever seen done, and it reflects a lot of your experience and time in the field. And there is an article on that as well, which we'll link in the show notes. But tell us a little bit about your van. What year is it? What motor?
Yeah, it started out, I think even before that, just wanting to identify a platform that could be used also as an office, like a field office, in a true sense of the word, where you could sit down, type, your laptop. You didn't have to start the motor necessarily or drive around in order to recharge the batteries in your laptop or other equipment that you have out in the field, so you can sustain yourself. And oddly enough, about half of the time I'm using this, it's parked outside of the archive. It's not out in the dust.
Right.
Literally, I have it parked in the 2-hour zone. And so I'm sitting in there, making sure that I've taken all of the copies of maps or coordinates or things like that for surveys that I'm working on. And it's a comfortable spot. I have a fridge in there, but I hunted around for something that would be comfortable, where I didn't have to necessarily get out of the vehicle as well. Not that I'm doing like commando research in the middle of some city somewhere or some village, but it just appealed to me that I could kind of spin myself around, go into the back and do some work. So the platform that came to mind for working in the Americas anyway was the Ford E350. At that time, there were some different conversions that were out there. But being in California and having seen a bunch of the more well thought out four-wheel drive conversions that Sportsmobile had done, I went with their conversion. But at the time, they did the conversion. They put on their penthouse top and the aluminous bumpers, front and rear, their Trojan bumpers. And then that was it. It just had 2 front seats and the whole thing was empty. Drove it around for a while. My mom joked around that she got in it one time. She's like, this is like the bakery delivery truck or something. Yeah. And so we drove it for well over a year and a half, maybe. Nothing in it, went skiing, took it everywhere. And all along the way, I started drawing out painter's tape, blue tape, where things could be, how I can have seating and storage and other stuff. And also staying cognizant of gross vehicle weight rating and what you could really do with it. Because that for me is paramount, no matter what vehicle I'm using. Yeah,
it does seem very minimalist. And you can also tell how much time you've traveled off a motorcycle, because it isn't overdone. It's one of the things that I think is most clever about your van is the cots that you integrated into the panels. Maybe touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, they're new old stock Huey helicopter seats. And they weigh, almost nothing. They're obviously made there, and they're, I would say, fire retardant, the material. Sure. So they don't add a lot of weight to the vehicle. It's completely negligible. Actually, the frames that AT Overland made, that was the actual weight that really got added in. But the advantage is that they can fold down and I can sleep on them, take a nap, whatever, or I can just fold down one and have a bench to sit on. Yeah. Do some work on my laptop, whatever, or just keep it as a spot, another ledge to put gear when I'm in a location.
And then it looks like you've got a bunch of netting and lashing points all along the walls. So you can kind of configure the van to whatever you're doing. If you're going skiing, it's one thing. If you're out in the field doing archaeology work, it's another thing. If you're out traveling, doing overlanding, it's another configuration.
Yeah, that's correct. I won't say we went crazy with the L-track, but we definitely put it in all the conceivable locations where not just where you'd want to have a tie down or lash point, but what would be in the van, because not everything is really strapped to the floor. It might be something taller where you have to go from side to side. And as you know, in a van, more so than a vehicle, than let's say something like a 4Runner or something like this. But when you put on the brake, it's
going to end up in your lap.
It's coming your way. It's coming forward, definitely. And even something as innocuous as like a sleeping bag or a pillow or something, it's flying forward.
Yeah.
And so I really focused on that, having the ability to lash down different items of weight or bulk as necessary. And then remove all that stuff, not obviously the L-track, but, and then the other thing we focused on was where the L-track is bolted in, because and where the screws actually went, because you can, of course, put L-track, like a strip of L-track, and it could be, let's say a meter long, and you only put a bolt at one end and the other end. And if your tie down point is in the middle,
sure,
you're going to have some issues
right.
if weight starts to, work against you. So we focused on that as well.
And it looked like you could even roll a motorcycle up in the back if you configured it the right way, if you took the right stuff out.
Yeah. And if the bike didn't have some killer suspension or anything like that.
Yeah, if it wasn't too tall. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
So that Parastick, that PD 100 that you had in Europe, is that the same one you have today?
Yeah, I still have it. Actually, it's had a very interesting trajectory. It started out as a California spec R100 GS. They called it the Bumblebee. I know that collectors are going to, be pretty angry with me after they hear what happened with the bike. But I had it for maybe a half a year, put it in a crate at Marty's BMW, which I think is no longer there. It was down the South Bay in California and area, and shipped it to Edinburgh. Literally shipped it. Like, I don't know, 3 months later, there was just a knock at my flat and there was this crate, and the guy had a crowbar, I cracked it open, and then they gave me some paperwork and then took off. And that was it. There's this California registered motorcycle.
That's hilarious.
So the first summer that I was heading down to Croatia, like I said, I went down to Newcastle, took the ferry across to Hamburg, and one of my buddies there, of course, he's a BMW freak as well, airhead freak. Well, that was the bike then. They were airheads still.
Yeah, that was the bike. Yeah.
And I got over to his house, and he said, well, what's all this stuff here? And he was referring to some of the emissions stuff that's on the bike. And so I said, well, I got it in California and it had smaller carburetors and all sorts of other stuff. And he said, man, we got get in the car. So we drove down to the main Beamer dealership in Hamburg, and literally with the microfiche and working with the parts guy, we got all the parts that should be on it for the PD. So at that time, it wasn't like you had to get on eBay or, know a guy who knew a guy.
You buy it at the dealership.
The tank was unpainted. It was gray, just primered, all the little fairing parts, air box, you name it. Then it came to the smog stuff, which was, of course, perplexing, just like any kind of vacuum system, like on some old FJ40 or something like this, something's leaking and it's just going to run terribly. And we couldn't figure out the best approach. It wasn't running that well when we started snipping things on our own. So we made a few phone calls and talked with a mechanic down at the BMW factory. You can't make this up. Down in Munich. And he explained to us, he said, okay, somewhere under the seat, I think, is the sticker that has all of the spaghetti that we add on for the California model. I think also the Swiss model had that emission stuff too. He said, you see everything there? Remove it all.
Remove all of it.
Yeah, remove all of it. Don't try and connect this with that and think it's going to bypass this. So we spent, I don't know, it must have been like 4 or 5 days working on this bike. And then it was transformed into the R100 PD, although it didn't start out life as that.
But it is so cool that you still have it. And recently you bought another airhead, right?
Yeah, picked up it is a PD, although I did some research on its original title, and it didn't start out life as a PD either. It started out life as just an R100 GS. Sure. Somebody picked up the PD parts. It still has some smog stuff on it. So yeah, we're making that a project bike for the journal. So we're going to do some interesting stuff to it.
Yeah, that sounds fun.
Yeah, it's a very under stressed motor.
Sure.
And so
they last
although
forever.
I like to leave things original, but you can do stuff to that motor to get better performance out of it, higher horsepower, and still keep it super reliable.
And in North America, that actually becomes a consideration. Obviously, when you're riding a motorcycle like that in Slovenia, or if you're riding it around Guatemala, you don't really need the extra horsepower, but North American roads, I mean, we're dealing with 75 plus mile an hour highway speed limits and crazy drivers driving at high speed. So it does really help to have something that moves down.
People don't think that, are like some of my European friends, they get on the Autobahn and scoot around. But if you're just kind of, zipping down to Spain for 2 weeks or something, things might be quite proximal. And then here, sometimes you're on the road for 2 days before you get at 75 miles an hour, before you get to the spot where you're going 3 miles an hour or less for the next week and a half on your GS adventure kind of ride. And it's definitely something that, we take into account here that maybe people don't overseas.
That's right.
Depending on the application.
And in all your time with riding motorcycles, what are some of the key takeaways that you've experienced from riding motorcycles?
Well, one of the things I think is that you have to have an open mind. Now, this is with a carbureted, air-cooled bike. Now, maybe it's different with more modern bikes where you can pull into a dealership and they can just fix it, or, they have more creature comforts. But I appreciate the fact that with the original manual and the Haynes manual, as long as you have the right tools, you just follow the directions and you could do anything. I mean, really, I've ripped that thing apart. I wouldn't say that I'm super mechanical. I mean, I'm not tearing apart the, FJ40 motor in my driveway. But with that bike, I've pretty much done most of the repairs. Speaking of Slovenia, by the way, one time I was visiting there and I was tinkering with the carburetors because I thought I could optimize it. I was riding, in the Alps. And,
sure, you're up at altitude.
And I thought, okay, I could tinker with it. I didn't rejet it or anything, but I would just kind of tinker with it. And I couldn't get it. They were synced, but it just wasn't really running optimally. And I was in Ljubljana in Slovenia. And a colleague of mine, he's now the head of the Department of Archaeology at the university there. He said, hey, well, you know that we have a similar model. It was the RS that our police force uses for patrol. And I know somebody over at the motor pool. So I rode the bike over with all the gear on it and everything. I rode it over to this motor pool. And one of the police mechanics dialed it back in. Of course, he had the little carb sync tool, and I was just using my ear. He dialed it back in. But I think back to your point of things that I've learned riding a motorcycle, it forces you to be minimalist. You interrogate every item that maybe at first you don't. You just kind of load things on and, you have your, and you realize
that's terrible.
Yeah. And you learn your lesson. Like, okay, wait a second. I had like 3 pairs of shoes and I got my boots, and then I want to, maybe something's going to be upscale. So I want to have those shoes and that pair of tennis shoes or whatever. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't bring another pair of shoes with you, but you really interrogate the bulk, the necessity, the weight.
Yeah.
And it definitely, that parlays into your thinking with 4 wheels as well, 4 or more wheels, I should say.
Yeah.
And I think that it also helps you with your understanding when you travel about, okay, what do I really need? Obviously you want to be warm. You want to be fed reasonably well. You want to hydrate. You want to be safe from the elements. But then after that, do you need like 3 different colored beanies?
All right. And it's amazing, the stuff that we bring along. I think about now, I'm ready to leave for Africa in a few days, and I'm going to ride a Triumph down to Swaziland. And the boots that I'm going to use to get on the plane are the same boots that I'm going to use to ride the bike. And how I deal with some protection is I have these D30 knee pads and shin guards that I use to augment the same boots that I get to wear every day otherwise, or drive a vehicle otherwise. And then I have these with all of these new barefoot style shoes. Now, these aren't the ones that have the individual little toes, but they're very simple barefoot style shoes that you could use take to the gym. You can have in a hotel or Airbnb or in the campground that make it a lot more comfortable to get out of your motorcycle boots and have a second pair of shoes. But they pack down to nothing because the top of the shoe itself has very little structure. So it's really just the footbed that you've got to compress down. And I have a strap that I compress them all down with. And it ends up being very minimalist that way. Whereas I've done trips in the past where I've brought the big heavy motorcycle boots, and then you're trying to figure out, where am I going to put these things? How do I even get them on the plane with all my other gear? So wearing the same boots, and I know like Lois Price and others that do a lot of long distance international overland travel, they just wear heavy duty boots every day. They don't wear motorcycle boots because then they can walk in them, they can hike in them, they can walk through town without looking like a stormtrooper.
I agree. Yeah. My favorite in that regard, I stopped using motorcycle boots other than just going on a ride where that was it, like for the day out and back, in the same location. My favorites are Danners.
Yeah, those are great
because you can hike in them. Maybe I'm not a fatalist or anything like that, but I always think, okay, wait a second. What if the bike broke down and I had to walk somewhere?
Right.
Would I want to walk in these sort of motocross-esque ADV boots, more than a mile or 2 or 5 miles?
Even a mile.
And I've had to do that.
Even before. A mile would be rough.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And I've had to do that and then learn the lesson like, hey, that sucked. I have blisters and it's just uncomfortable. And then of course the space. And when you just have the one and only pair, or if you have, like you said, a pair of collapsed tennies, sneaks or something like
Sure.
that, and not looking like a stormtrooper. And it's part of it is not so much the look like, fashion.
No, it's blending in with the locals. So
blending in with locals, and just having equipment that's multifunctional, that just doesn't serve one function. Obviously your helmet is pretty unifunctional. And of course, even jackets and pants, there's stuff now that really, if you're hard pressed to tell that it's actually made for motorcycle travel.
Yeah, no question. And they're getting more and more mindful of the fact that, you can separate the armor from the jacket itself. And then you end up being able to wear the jacket as a hard shell when you're off the bike. And it doesn't mean that heavy duty ADV style boots aren't appropriate in certain scenarios. We're not suggesting that people be unsafe, but I just find that the more that the motorcycle trip is related to travel, the more I want to wear boots that allow me to hike back into that waterfall, or I can walk around a colonial village and experience the history of it without damaging my feet trying to walk around in those ADV boots. But if I'm doing the Trans-America Trail, or if I'm going across southern Utah in technical terrain, absolutely, I've got gnarly heavy duty motocross style boots, because you're trying to protect yourself from the inevitable drops that happen on the dirt. But I think it is so important to consider, even if you don't ride a motorcycle, how minimal can you go when you pack your vehicle? Even if you have a sportsmobile that has a ton of payload, how minimal can you travel? Because then the sportsmobile even performs better. It does better off-road. It gets better gas mileage. There's less stuff to distract you. If the vehicle gets stolen, you've lost less stuff than if you just pack everything to the gills.
Yeah, definitely. And that all comes from my perspective, traveling on a motorcycle.
And I love how disarming motorcycles are. I think it's because it's so relatable to everybody in the world. It's usually the first vehicle that they see, even in very remote parts of the world. Motorcycles and a motorcyclist are very disarming. They don't come across as something official or tactical or whatever.
Yeah, and I think, and most people have not only just seen one, many people have been on them, or they know that person riding that bike, it requires skill.
Yeah.
It requires that they pay attention to what they're doing. And wow, he has a backpack and one little pannier filled with, something.
Yeah.
Whoa, that's crazy too. And
very cool.
And so it's immediately engaging.
I think so.
And you don't have to be in some remote location. You could just be in some other town in your own state.
Yeah.
And there's a connection there.
There certainly is. And it leads me to another thing that I know that you're passionate about, which is edge tools. And that's obviously comes from our story earlier about finding the hand axe. But what knife do you typically carry every day? What knife do you typically carry when you travel? What should someone be looking for in an edge tool like that as a traveler?
Personally, there are a couple of aspects that you need to take into account. One, you can't always travel with it, or you're not allowed to.
Right. You got to put it in your check.
Yeah. And obviously there are different aspects of that too.
Sure.
It's just illegal, or that, you can't show it, and there are plenty of people definitely more well-versed than I am that talk about that topic. And you can always pick up something, for example, once you get to your location, and it doesn't have to be some uber cool knife with the clip on it or anything like that. You go in any hardware store, or even some vendors of fruit, and you can pick up a knife that, depending on what you're needing it for. If it's for, it could be everything really. It doesn't have to be just for self-protection, but if you're just looking for a camp knife, like a paring knife that you get,
sure,
for, under $5, maybe even less, that's used by all the locals that you pick up at the local supermarket, and everyone has one. And that's what they use to cut their fruit or prepare their meals, and you're good to go. And the other thing is that also is what everyone else has. So it doesn't, if you get to some checkpoint and they say, hey, take out the contents of your pocket, and there you have the same knife that they have and their parents have and their kids have back at home. Well, you're fitting in with that too.
I think there's a lot of validity to that. I remember when you and I were trying to deal with the police after we got caught by the militia.
That was excitement for you more than me.
in Kenya, but they dump out the contents of one of the bags, and there was a lot of more tactical looking components. And this guy was convinced that you and I were spooks, and we were supposed to disclose. Remember,
it was
He kept saying you got to disclose your mission, and
but meanwhile there was a titanium spork, and
all of these
some paracord that wasn't like a non-standard, just kind of a fun color. And can't remember some 123 batteries.
Right.
What else was in there? Maybe my little shortwave radio.
Yeah, it was
in a bag that's shaped like a football. But yeah, they went through that, and
that just happened to be the one that they picked. Was the one with all the paracord and everything,
and the spork.
Yeah, I know.
What's this?
I know. It's really funny, but it is important to think about how, oftentimes we have access to these very cool tactical minded pieces of equipment, but if we travel with those things, how is that going to look to someone that happens to go through our stuff? And is it going to create an uncomfortable conversation, or you're going to have to justify what you're doing? I mean, just you and I being military aged males in that part of Kenya already raises suspicion.
And the matte khaki colored G-Wagons. That didn't help either.
It didn't help at all. Yeah. 3 of them in a line. Yeah. It definitely looked like a convoy, and they were not convinced of our intentions, although they finally did let us go. But
it was a spork that
What's your favorite folder right now that you carry?
I would say it's a newer knife maker. It's a friend of mine. He just retired from the Navy SEALs, and the name of his company that he started for his knife making is called Gooseworks, and it's very small production.
Cool.
And he has been putting some time in with noted makers like Ernie Emerson and Robert Truzula and others, Bill Harsey, people like that, where they have both a folder and a fixed blade aspect to what they do. And he spent some time in those trenches, just kind of helping out and sweeping their shops and looking at what they do and getting tips and tricks and things that didn't work early on. And I really like where he's coming from with the design, and also just the materials, minimalist kind of approach that he has. And the fact that he puts razor sharp edges on the knives before he mails them out. He spends a lot of time. I was up there in his workshop, and he was showing me how he sharpens everything. And I'm sure that if you look at like the labor costs, which he's not doing it because of that, but he spends so much time sharpening each knife and getting things right so that when you use it, it's doing what you need it to do.
It's a tool that's ready to go.
Yeah. If it needs a slice, it's going to slice. You're not going to have to sit there and saw it back and forth.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I also appreciate old school things like a Swiss Army knife.
Right. That just goes into the pocket. Yeah.
Yeah. And they're useful, for a myriad of things around the camp and just what you're doing. And now see, one of the things I almost never travel. It's very rare that I travel without checking something in.
Right.
It kind of depends, obviously, on whether it's work or play and what kind of work. And so I usually have a check-in bag, not always, but I usually have a check-in bag. And so obviously once you have a check-in bag, you can check in plenty of your pocket knives or other kinds of knives that you want, or anything with an edge. And so other than the fact that somebody might go through it and take it en route, then you have your stuff.
Yeah,
but it's not always nice. The case. I mean, sometimes you do have to, once you get there, go track something down, and that's part of the deal.
And I do that oftentimes. I'll just go get a folder, pocket knife, or whatever. A mutual friend of ours, Patrick Ma from Prometheus Design Works, he sells a little folder that looks like a Boy Scout knife almost. And it's just very nicely put together. It's very discreet in the pocket. And that's typically the one that I'll toss in my check bag, because it is totally unassuming. And if you clear the contents of your pockets out, it looks like a camp knife. Very simple little tool. It's very understated, but made in the United States and extremely high quality and a very sharp blade, which is nice as well.
Yeah, it's important to have.
So then
you also have to take into account that things might disappear.
Yeah, for sure.
And you might need to give something over.
That's right.
It might be taken before you even get there. You might have that notification in your bag that says,
yeah, we found this
and we kept it, or it's just not there.
It's just gone.
And so I always stress that with people when they talk about, well, I'm going to be working here or going there, and what should I have? And I always say, well, whatever you have, it better not be super sentimental. And not like that's the one that your dad had or something, or,
yeah, that's true.
You have to be ready to give it over, lose it. not just mess it up, because you can always resharp. You should be able, that's the other point I think is important, is you should be able to sharpen a knife, because if it's not sharp, well, what's the point? Unless it is the point that you wanted, which is, a different topic too, but you should have all those qualities, so, be able to get rid of it.
And when we were in Uganda and Kenya, I think we had some Winkler knives with some fixed blades, right? What should people be looking for around a fixed blade? One thing I really like about a fixed blade is that the immediacy of it and how it can be positioned on the belt, et cetera. You don't need to open anything up. You just grab the handle and the knife is ready to do work. Tell the listener, what do you typically look for in a fixed blade?
Well, I mean, for me, now I have my own preferences for items. And those knives that we had there were the Blue Ridge Hunters by Daniel Winkler. And he's a master smith. So even though Winkler 2 knives it's water jet and it's a production style, but he put a lot of time in forging and just as a one person show to get to where he is now. And so everything, the ergonomics, and it's, I'm obviously talking about those knives that we had in Kenya and Uganda, but I think it pertains to pretty much anything with a fixed blade. Well, with the folder as well, but since we're talking about fixed blades, it should have an ergonomic aspect where it feels right. Now, like what you put in your hand might not be something that works for me. So it's not just, well, okay, Scott gave it to me and I'm supposed to have this. Maybe it's not going to work for me. Personally, I like to have fixed blades that have multiple capabilities. So I'm not necessarily into carrying something where it has it's only defensive in nature. When I'm traveling, I want to be able to do other things with it. And it might be just
slice an apple. Yeah.
Or everyone says, hey, breakfast is served, and then you can slice a piece of butter off of the bar and put it on your one piece of toast that you're going to have for the day.
And it doesn't look like Rambo made the thing. I mean, those knives that we had, they looked very pedestrian.
Yeah. And I like that too. As a matter of fact, if it fell on the ground, it just looks like a simple camp knife. It doesn't look necessarily like there's some nefarious, reason for having it. Having said that, I think, depending on your training and background, it is, and it goes way back to prehistory, having something with an edge and having something with a point. And, maybe you might have to defend yourself with it. It doesn't have to be made for that purpose though. I mean, you can defend yourself. You can defend yourself with a butter knife. Yeah. You'll be fine with it. And
but that requires a little bit more training.
It does. Yeah. But at the same time, when you have a knife that can do various things immediately when you pull it out of the sheath, I prefer that.
Yeah. I remember when we were again in that area of Kenya, we had some problems with one of the vehicles, and there was this crowd that was forming around us, and there was that one guy that was clearly
I remember that. Yeah.
Drunk and on drugs, I suspect, eyes completely bloodshot, and he picked me, the biggest guy out of the group.
Fortunately.
Well, and I don't know, because I don't know what I would have done with him. I mean, you could see from his hands, he said he was a boxer and that he wanted to fight, and you could see from the condition of his hands that he did do that on a regular basis. I mean, they look like anvils as opposed to human hands. And those points of tension and those points of intensity when we're traveling. Now, fortunately, nothing happened. We were able to just through conversation and misdirect, directing his attention. Otherwise, we were able to resolve the situation. But those things can accelerate very quickly, and it is good to have training and some awareness around that.
Yeah, definitely. And also in the improvisation of an edged tool or a point, something with a point. Yeah. It doesn't even have to be that. I mean, you can, anything really, right? A pen.
Sure.
It's something from your toolkit, screwdriver.
Yeah.
I mean, it's endless really when you think about it, but that stuff comes up.
Years ago, you gave me a pen that I travel with almost exclusively. And who makes that? That thing is amazing.
Oh, you know what? I almost shouldn't give it away, but County Com, they make great really great pens. I mean, they fall into the category, I suppose, of tactical, although a lot of the ones
doesn't look that tactical.
It does. Yeah. And I think I gave you the stainless steel one. Yeah. And it's with knurling, and they use the Fisher Space Pen refill. So
it's really heavy and balanced in the hand, and it writes beautifully. It writes
really well. And it writes like, in the astronauts, it can be upside down with it or whatever, but also it writes through, like if your paper is wet, it'll still write through onto the paper, and this is like sort of field geek kind of thing, like, oh, who cares about that? But actually I do care about that, because, if I'm working out in the field and it's foggy or something like that, and I got to write down on my clipboard that I left on the hood of the truck overnight. All right. That does matter.
Yeah, but, for sure.
But yeah, I really like their pens. They're fairly understated.
Yeah. What a neat piece of kit for sure.
Yeah. Definitely.
And speaking of that, what are some other recent additions to your kit that you just have kind of fallen in love with?
Well, this will sound a little bit bizarre.
Okay.
Maybe, I don't know. One of the pieces that I don't even know who makes it. It's one of those cubes.
Okay.
That you inflate.
All right.
And it has a small solar panel on one side. And this is a light. It's an LED light.
Yeah.
And it has I think 3 settings.
Luminade maybe?
Maybe, but there's so many people that have copied it already.
Yeah.
And it has 3 settings of the LED plus a flashing, like a strobe.
Sure.
And it packs completely flat. I use it on every trip now. If it's just
they're clever,
putting it in the bathroom so that, in a dark hotel room, that's pitch black because I needed to sleep when I landed, leave it in the dash or, somewhere, during the day, recharge it. And it's so simple.
Yeah. I think they're really clever. And I've thought oftentimes about maybe carrying a couple of them with me when I'm traveling. Cause and think about that family that we encountered in Uganda, the woman who spoke some English, and we helped get her kids to the school and everything. Wouldn't it have been amazing to give her one of those so that way those kids could read maybe later into the night and make a little bit of a difference in her life, because I was so impressed by her as a human being. And I'd like to have some of those along with me, because they are so compact. They'd be really easy to give away in the ways that make sense after you've established some rapport with somebody, not just handouts. But that would have been a great, I think, situation for that too. Yeah. And recently you and I both got some down jackets from Patrick at Prometheus Design.
Oh, that's I think one of the coolest things.
That's a pretty bitchin' jacket.
It is. And all down is not created equal. And the piece that I especially appreciate out of it is on the inside, kind of over your rear hip, there is a carrying case. And at first I just thought, okay, that's cool. That it's like a stuff sack.
Right.
When I opened it up, and then I realized that it's a stuff sack that's shaped like those neck rolls that you use when you fly on an airplane. And that's I'm not sure if that's thinking outside the box, because everyone knows those neck rolls. You go through an airport and you see them, they're all for sale. Everywhere. Yeah. With the batteries and then the phone chargers, and then they're always there, totally ubiquitous. But with this one, you stuff your down jacket in it, and there you go. And then you actually showed me that the whole thing can be turned, not that little piece, but the other part into a pillow.
Yeah. The pocket that the neck pillow is in is reversible, and it's also fleece lined, and you can reverse the whole jacket into that and zip it closed. And then you have a camp pillow, which we talk about multi-use things, but it's this kind of mid-weight, slightly heavier than the typical down sweaters and stuff that are really popular from Patagonia and North Face. And
but it's not like something that you would take to the polar region.
It isn't. It's just the right weight, especially if you layer. It's got a great DWR finish on it. I've been out in the rain and I was worried about it because of being down, and it repelled water for 20 or 30 minutes when I was out in those conditions hiking. It's also hooded, which is really nice.
And it's the material on the inside of the hood, same as the pockets.
Really comfortable.
It's comfortable. Yeah.
And it doesn't make a lot of noise. It's one of the things I don't like about those nylon finishes is when your head's inside the hoodie or the hood, then it makes all this crackling and noise, and it doesn't make any of that noise with that fleece lining, which I really like. And then it's got this great chest pocket that I can put an iPhone on and, listen to music or a podcast or whatever, have real quick access to wallets and stuff like that right there at the chest. So that's actually a really great jacket. Yeah. Prometheus Design Works. We'll put that in the show notes as well. And Patrick's a cool guy, fellow knife, watch, overland guy, and made in the United States too. Try to find a jacket like that's made in the US. It's very difficult to find. Small batch company, so they may or may not be in stock by the time
you just got to tough it out.
Yeah, you just got to wait, plan ahead. It's definitely worth the wait. And then another thing that I got recently is a Hasselblad that I'm going to take to Africa, which I'm excited to shoot. And you've been a long time Leica shooter, film Leica still.
Film Leicas, yeah. I mean, I also shoot digi with that Sony Alpha 7, but I have that nice little adapter so I can shoot my lights glass with that Sony body, and I like it. I also like the fact that Sony's pretty small body.
It is,
and it's familiar to me, having used the Leicas, the small M Leicas for so long. It just feels right.
And you've taken some beautiful images. Some of them even have been featured in Overland Journal in black and white. And I remember that was one of the other highlights of our trip. We were again in Kenya, and we had camped down this little wash, and this kid
and we thought we were nobody would find us.
We were in the middle of nowhere.
We thought we were really cool.
And right. Yeah. And that's when the Corolla comes by, right?
Yeah,
but this little kid was herding camel and up this wash, and he sees us with all of our G-Wagons. He's trying to figure out like we're from outer space. But he was very curious and very calm, and we had no way to communicate with him other than just through basic human communication, hand signals and smiles and things like that. But you ended up handing him the Leica and showing him how to advance the film. And I think you stopped him down so his shots would be clear. And that was just such a neat
I have great photos of him taking photos of me.
Yeah.
With the and I had the digi camera.
Yeah.
And he's shooting the film camera at me, and the framing was fine. That would be cool to kind of put together. I think,
I think that would be neat. That would be neat to do. And I remember it's one of my most favorite photos I've ever taken. And I took it with my iPhone. It was of him holding that Leica, and he has this fantastic smile on his face. And I was smiling the same. I felt like we all felt this real connection with this kid. It's those moments as travelers that are unforgettable, and they're so special, and they remind me of why that is the stuff that's most important. Those are the ingredients of memories. We'll long forget the knife that we brought or some gadget that we added to our vehicle, but we'll never forget those moments because they were so definitive.
And it's an interaction with a fellow human,
right?
Somebody who's from a different culture, different language, different place, but it's a fellow human.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the draws, with travel for me anyway.
Yeah. And he was just as stoked as we were. Like he was,
and
he thought it was the coolest thing
what is he
that we were
say
there.
When he goes back, you guys won't believe I saw these guys and they were just camping. I don't know why they had to camp in these tents,
right? Yeah.
Rooftop tents.
Yeah. So funny. It was very cool. Yeah.
But the interaction, with somebody else and just to have a giggle, there was no commonality at all other than that's a fellow human.
Yeah. And maybe that's the theme of this whole podcast is as we travel more, and as we consider travel more, that we begin to step beyond the stuff. We begin to step beyond the vehicle and how we identify with the truck that we drive or the motorcycle that we ride. And we start to become this accumulation of these experiences and these interactions with other human beings around the world. I mean, I think back on that trip, and certainly the G-Wagons that we were driving were very cool, but it was the time that I spent with you and Stanley and the locals and the people that we interacted with that form the memories and the images that I took away and the stories that I told about that experience. It had very little to do with the gadgets. And I really do appreciate your time, Bryon, on this stuff because it shows how far back humans have been traveling. As soon as we could find a way to bring enough food or a way to move across the land with some support, we started to get outside of our very small zone that we occupied, and we started to see what was over the next ridge. And that's been for a lot of human history. And that's what we do today as travelers. And let's interact with that history. Let's respect the cultures that we encounter. Let's be mindful and minimalist in the way that we travel so that it doesn't distract us from those experiences. Those are definitely great lessons, don't you think?
Definitely. And also not imposing any of my standards or norms or expectations upon anybody else.
Yeah.
I mean, there isn't a reason for it. There really isn't. And on the individual level, there's, just hang with the locals. And if they do something on a Friday or a Sunday or whatever, participate in it.
Experience it.
Yeah.
That pickup game of soccer might be one of the best memories that you'll ever have of your travels, or handing a kid a soccer ball or whatever. Those kinds of interactions as humans, I think, are so valuable and so important too. So I really appreciate your time. There's 1,000 other things we could talk about. We didn't even get into watches. We didn't get into your Tacoma.
We could,
and everything like that. Yeah, I know. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, Bryon and I both have an appreciation for unique watches. And one of the reasons for that, and we'll kind of end it on this, but it's one of the few types of currencies that you can carry with you right on your person. A recognizable watch brand is a way to have a get out of jail free, in a sense, or buy a ticket home. So they're very portable. And I think maybe we'll schedule another podcast for a year or so from now. We'll dig into those other things.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we could talk about that.
Yeah, we certainly
hours
could.
On end.
And we'll link all of this cool stuff in the show notes. Bryon, I'm so grateful for the time that you spent with us this morning and telling us your stories and that amazing life that you've lived. It's such an inspiration.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, Scott, and look forward to doing it again very soon.
Absolutely. Well, thanks everybody for listening.